Hi everyone, this is the next video about the poem From the Journal of a Disappointed Man. So first of all, this poem, like some other poems, it has multiple meanings. You can read it on a surface level. It's just one man observing a group of men who are doing some building. Or you can read it as a metaphor. And I'll talk a little bit more about those things as I go through the poem. But what first stood out to me from this title, From the Journal of a Disappointed Man. Obviously, first of all, you can just take the reading that perhaps this is meant to be an excerpt from a journal, in the same way that when you're at GCSE, you may have studied extract from the prelude, so Wordsworth's much longer poem. So one way of reading this poem is that we are just looking at a snippet from a journal from a man who is disappointed. You can perhaps think about why he's disappointed or what he's disappointed about. I'm not going to touch too much on that in this video, but it's something I'd like you to consider and think about. But what's also interesting about this title is that From the Journal of a Disappointed Man was actually a publication in 1919 by Bruce Cummings, who wrote it under a pseudonym, which I'll show you in just a second. And this was a journal about a man who actually got diagnosed with MS. He was interested in entomology, so the scientific study of insects, and it's just his journal or his diary. But in the diary, just one second. He talks and refers to his own egotism. He is an egotist. He's very egotistical in the journal. And he sort of elevates himself above other people. He sees himself as an intellectual. He is a naturist. He's interested in nature. He's interested in these insects. He's a thinker. And there are times perhaps when he looks down on other people who don't embody those qualities. Now, I only had a very, very quick glance at the publication, but I have on the PowerPoint that I'll upload to the portal, giving you a link where you can find out a little bit more and you can look in a little more detail if you want to. But as I was flicking through, I think it was on about page 32, I did come across one extract from the journal, which I did think linked quite closely to this poem. So I'll read it for you because I'm sure it's probably quite blurry on your screen there. But he talks about life without a purpose seeming void. He says, the monotonous pursuit of our daily vocations, the soldier, sailor, candlestick maker, so they go on, never living, but only working, never thinking, but only hypnotizing themselves by the routine and punctuality of their lives into just so many mechanical toys, warranted to go on for so long, and then stop when death takes them. And when we look at the poem, hopefully that sort of will resonate with you, because in one way that's what this poem seems to be like. The thinker, the narrator, the intellectual is looking at these labourers who are attempting to do some work to appear, and perhaps there's a question about how valuable that work is and how valuable their lives are by consequence. So there's a kind of an interesting idea there, I suppose, about occupation, and meaning and purpose of life and those sorts of things, which we'll explore a little bit more as we go through the poem. Okay, so to start with the poem, the first line, I discovered these men driving a new pile into the pier. So you've got a pier and the pile, the sort of the timbers or the steels that kind of support it, and they are trying to put a new pile into that pier. And that's what the man in this poem, the narrator of the poem, is watching, if we read it just as a journal entry about that observation. Interesting, though, perhaps, is the use of the word discovered, and linked to what I just said. If this poem is inspired by the publication in 1919, Journal of a Disappointed Man, where there was the man, Cummings, who was an entomologist, who was a scientist, who was looking at kind of insects and nature, then you can see why perhaps the poet has chosen to use the word discovered. So here the narrator kind of sets themselves up on a bit of a pedestal, perhaps, looking down on these men. He is the observer, and he has discovered them, as if perhaps this is a scientific experiment, as if this is an examination of mankind. There was all the paraphernalia, chains, pulleys, cranes, ropes, and as I said, a wooden pile, a massive affair, swinging. You've got a conversational tone at the start of this poem. It is a journal, a diary entry, so it's as if perhaps the narrator is speaking either directly to the reader, or as if the diary itself, the journal itself, is its audience, as I said. So if the narrator is in kind of conversation dialogue with their own diary. You've got the listing of what the observer is seeing, and these cranes and the big wooden pile that they're trying to get into the pier. But you've also got the word paraphernalia, a quite complex word, quite sophisticated vocabulary. And so also we get an early indication in this poem of that voice of the narrator, the voice of the speaker. They're an educated, intellectual man. They have complex, sophisticated vocabulary. And that will be interesting and important as the poem goes on, because it will be contrasted against the vocabulary of these working men. So it goes on, continuing this idea of what he's seeing initially, that big pile hanging over the water on a long wire. Everything else was in the massive style as well, even the men, very powerful men, very ruminative and silent men ignoring me. So it's quite clear to see here the repetition of men, and so men and these men perhaps are a focus of this poem, and so it has led people to talk about this poem as being a poem about masculinity, about what it means to be a man, a stereotypical man. And the first observations of this intellectual thinker and narrator and speaker is that they are massive. So what's emphasized to us is their physical size and their physical strength. But again, we get still more evidence of this narrator being intellectual, using the word ruminative, and the narrator, the speaker, is kind of supposing what these men are thinking and feeling. He says that they are ruminating on something, they are thinking deeply about something. So it's almost like he's got a hypothesis which he's kind of trying out. These are his suppositions about these men. The men are silent, and that idea is emphasised throughout the poem as well. They're silent, they're not talking, whereas the narrator in a way is talking all the way through this poem. It is their narrative voice that we hear, it is their articulation that we hear. The men that the narrator is looking at are silent, they don't speak. They don't have the words perhaps to articulate their feelings or emotions, they choose not to. As I said, there's some ideas there perhaps about stereotypical or conventional masculinity, men not talking, keeping things to themselves, just doing. So there's some questions about that perhaps here in this poem. He says the men are ignoring them. I mean, the men are just getting on with their work, but we've got the end stop here after that phrase, which kind of helps to emphasize the distinction between the man, the narrator, the speaker, the intellect, and the other men who are working in this poem. They are very, very different. They're very separate. In terms of the form of this poem, you've got that diary entry, that journal, this outside observer looking at these other men. They're very, very detached, very, very separate, very distinct. And as I said, that idea of the hypothesis or the supposition, the narrator deciding what these men are thinking and feeling without actually knowing, then we can see that here in this stanza. Speech was not something to interest them. That's the statement the narrator makes, as if he knows what these men are thinking and feeling. They are not interested in speech, is his belief. And if they talked at all, it was like this: let go, or hold tight, all monosyllables. So as I said earlier, we had the words of the narrator, paraphernalia, ruminative, and that's contrasted against the monosyllabic language of these men who speak in single syllables: let go, hold tight. So the poet is clearly showing us this difference between these two men, or these types of men, the thinker, the intellect, and these working labourers. Also, I suppose the idea of the difference is added to them. This is kind of the personal first-person perspective, I of the speaker. This is the them, these other men who are very, very different to the speaker. But again, in terms of the tone and the form of this poem, that observational style continues. It's almost like a documentary here, and the scientist or the narrator here is voicing what they're thinking as they're observing their specimen. If they talked, it was like this. So they're sharing with us what these people, what these creatures are like that are being put under the microscope and kind of examined here. But again, we get an end stop here, which kind of shows us a slight shift, slight change in that direction. Nevertheless, however, let me continue. You know, the more I watched, the more I found out. By paying close attention to the obscure movements of one working on a ladder by the water's edge, I could tell that for all their strength and experience, these men were up against a great difficulty. So I suppose the movements of these men are obscure to the narrator, who isn't used to this world of work, physical work. Their life is very, very different. They have the life of the articulate intellect. But then perhaps the idea of that egotism that I talked about at the start, which was a feature of the original The Journal of a Disappointed Man, I could tell. The narrator kind of elevates their own intellect, their own importance. Again, I can work out what these people are thinking, what they're feeling, what they're doing. I could tell just by looking at them because I'm superior and I have this wonderful, intelligent mind. And the narrator can tell that they're up against a great difficulty. So the narrator, at least, even though they're very different to these men, can acknowledge the experience they're going through, is able to perhaps empathize with these men and maybe therefore show them compassion is one way of looking at this poem. It perhaps, whereas lots of the poems about making clear how different these two are, it perhaps also shows us that even though we have in this world people who are very, very different, we also have similarities and that we all come against struggles in our lifetime. Could perhaps be one way of looking at it. But then I suppose that's undermined at the start of the next stanza, I cannot say what. So the narrator knows that these men are experiencing difficulties, but they cannot explain what that difficulty is. So they can't empathize to that degree. They don't have the knowledge, perhaps, of these men to be able to say what exactly it is that's wrong. The intellect, the intelligent narrator, the speaker, they can't solve these men's problems. They don't understand them. They don't know about this physical manual labor. So I cannot say what. So perhaps, at least here, the narrator acknowledges the limits to their intelligence at this point. Every one of the monsters was silent on the subject. Baffled, I thought at first, but then I realised indifferent and tired of the whole business. So some interesting things here in this stanza. I guess, firstly, what really, really stands out is the fact that the speaker refers to these working men as monsters. And obviously that word monsters has different connotations. They're monsters. Does that mean they're disgusting? They're abhorrent to the speaker, to the narrator? He doesn't like this style of man and this way of working. Monsters are also sometimes things that we fear. So is the narrator fearful of these men in some way? Why would that be? Is it this idea that actually the working class man, if he rallied together with other working class men, would be incredibly powerful and could overtake the kind of elite and those more intellectual classes, perhaps? Is it that idea? Is it just to emphasize the size and the strength, like monsters? These men appear to be very, very different to the narrator. Again, their silence is stressed, though, and that is a recurring motif throughout this poem, how quiet these men, how silent they are, how they don't talk, how they just go about their business. And I guess it's up to you to consider whether you think the poet is kind of admiring that or criticizing that, questioning it, challenging it. We've got the caesura in the middle of the line, pausing, and that's probably reflective again in terms of the form of this poem, this stream of consciousness of the narrator, baffled, I thought at first. So at first, when he looks at them, he just thinks that they're confused, they're baffled. But then as he studies more closely, so perhaps going back to maybe the egotism of the narrator, their belief in their self-importance and intellect, they figured it out by looking more closely. But actually they're not baffled. These men are indifferent and tired of the whole business. And some people have read this poem in a kind of a Marxist reading. So Karl Marx, the famous socialist, and also Max Weber, another famous socialist, they talked about something called the alienation of labour, which was when, if you were doing a job and you don't connect with that job or enjoy that job, then it can lead to kind of feelings of misery and isolation and depression. It was kind of introduced at the turn of the Industrial Revolution when some machines were taking over the roles of man and kind of leaving them very, very despondent. So some people have kind of read those ideas into this poem, but nonetheless, even if you don't look at it in that style, the narrator here can see that actually these men, they aren't enjoying their work. They're indifferent and they're tired. So some reflections perhaps on the kind of the life of the labourer and the physical man. And again, maybe the narrator is contrasting their own life with that and seeing more purpose and value in their life, the life of the thinker, compared to this kind of mundane work. The man nearest to me, so in terms of the kind of structure of the poem, we get a narrowing of focus on one particular individual now in this cluster of men. The man nearest to me, still saying nothing, but even in this individual, he is still the same as all of the other men, still not saying nothing. That silence is emphasized to us. But crossing his strong arms over his chest showed me that for all he cared, the pile could go on swinging until the crack of doom. So more reference to the physicality of these men, the strong arms being zoomed in and emphasized to us. But again, going back to that idea that I just mentioned, this man doesn't care about the work that he's doing. And for all he cared, that pile, that big piece of wood that they're struggling to put into place, can carry on swinging until the crack of doom. So the crack of doom is referring to the Christian idea of Judgment Day, that God will decide your eternal fate, at the crack of doom on this Judgment Day. And so really what it means in the poem is that this labourer, the narrator is supposing, thinks that piece of wood can carry on swinging until the end of the world. It makes no odds to them. They're not really interested in it. They're not really passionately involved in this work. And then a shift again after that doom and after that end stop. I should say, I watched them at least an hour, and to do the men justice, their slow efforts to overcome the secret problem did continue, then gradually slackened and finally ceased. So again, a few different things in this stanza. The first perhaps is the idea that the narrator was able to watch them for an hour. So the narrator obviously has lots of time on their hands, perhaps compared to these men is quite idle. The men are working hard for the hour. The narrator is just watching and observing. It's then as if the narrator tries to kind of compliment these men, but they did try for an hour in their efforts to solve the problem. So you're sort of noting down their kind of strengths, again, perhaps as if he was observing a scientific specimen or an insect. This is what it did well, this is what it didn't do. So for an hour they worked. That's slightly undermined by the adjective slow. He sees it as a slow process. Perhaps they won't be very, very successful in their efforts. But they did continue. Again, the caesura at the end of the line, creating that pause, slows down the pace of this stanza. So we kind of perhaps see the slowing of the men in their work, in their efforts, then gradually slackened and finally ceased. Got a rhythm created in that last line, with this slowing rhythm with, words which have multiple syllables, slowing down the pace, gradually slackened and finally ceased. Also added to that and the mirroring of gradually and finally, slackened, ceased. So the syllables of those words creating that rhythmic pattern, slowing down this line, mirroring the idea of the men slowing down. And then again, the end stop though, drawing our attention to they ceased, they stopped trying. And then, because we have that end stop, the shift now to another man who's been singled out. One massive man, so we've got repetition of that word massive, repetition again of the word man, so the idea that this poem is perhaps focusing on ideas of man, ideas of masculinity. One massive man after another, so the group of men now, abandoned his position and leaned on the iron rail to gaze down like a mystic into the water. So you get a very clear, vivid visual imagery in this stanza. One man gives up, walks away, looks down. Another man gives up, walks away, looks down. The poet has included the iron rail, probably quite deliberately again to conjure up those kind of images of industrialization. Iron is a very, very strong metal, so it kind of links this idea of these conventional masculine ways of working, this physical work as well, hard work. But then contrast that with the idea that these men gaze down like a mystic into the water. So you've got a clear contrast between the iron and the water. And again, there's lots of different ways perhaps that you might want to interpret that and consider why there is that juxtaposition. Iron is solid, water is fluid. Perhaps the iron is to be seen as masculine. Is the water feminine? Iron, man-made material, making these piers or these industrial structures, whereas the water is natural. So I'll leave you to think and ponder that a little bit more yourselves. And these men, though, are gazing down like a mystic into it. So I suppose one interpretation, the idea here is the narrator is saying that these men are looking down into the water and they're trying to find answers in the same way you might go to a mystic to try and give you answers to your questions, to find out what is ahead for you in the world. And I suppose then there's a contrast between the kind of supernatural here and the man-made as well. No one spoke. No one said what they saw. So again, the silence though. No one is sharing anything that they may have found out. Maybe there were no answers looking into that big black hole. Perhaps the image of the men looking into this big black hole as well, or the water beneath, is kind of trying to show the insignificance of man in the giant universe in the same way a romantic poem would as well, perhaps, which is also criticizing kind of industrialization and those sorts of things. Maybe here the nature, the natural, or even the supernatural is the most impressive power. Again, still the observer narrowing, focusing now on one man in particular, so looking at this species, zooming in, looking at a particular specimen. Though one fellow did spit, and with round eyes followed the trajectory of his brown bolus, he'd been chewing tobacco on its slow descent into the same depths. So it's questionable the intention of this stanza. It certainly adds to perhaps the realism of the stanza. If this is a journal entry of someone recounting what they saw that day, then these are the sorts of things that you would see and that you would notice. So perhaps it just adds to that kind of the form of the poem and the validity and the belief we have in the form of this poem. Or perhaps, we're meant to focus on this slow descent, the depths that these men are staring into. If we kind of read this as a metaphor, is it these physical men, these stereotypically masculine men looking into the depths of the world or of their soul and questioning their purpose in life? Is it that we're meant to take away from it? Is it, like I said, that idea because it's descent and depths, how vast the universe is, how vast the world is, and these men are just tiny, insignificant in compared to that great sort of chain of being. And then again, narrowing to another one of the men here, this time the foreman, so the sort of man who's in charge of these working men. The foreman, and the most original thinker. So again, that tone of that documentary continues, zooming on this particular specimen in this group from the species. Smoked a cigarette to relieve the tension. It's interesting that when the narrator talks about the foreman smoking a cigarette, it gives the foreman a reason why, to relieve the tension, which kind of places him above the character that was zoomed into in the previous stanza that was chewing tobacco and then spat it out, as if that act was perhaps meaningless. So it's almost, again, the idea of kind of classification. So perhaps if it's based on the idea of Cummings, when they were investigating the insects, they would classify them and put them in a kind of a rank or a hierarchy. We've got the same idea here. The foreman is above just the person who was chewing the tobacco and spat it out. But they're obviously both below the narrator, the intellect himself. Afterwards, and with a heavy kind of majesty, he turned on his heels and walked away. So obviously the use of the majesty there, that furthers the idea that this foreman is above the other men in the ranks, more important. But it's a heavy kind of majesty, which suggests that perhaps even with that, there is a sense of burden maybe to that role, that responsibility. But he turned on his heels and walked away. So we get just carrying through this idea of observation. The narrator is observing these men, and now the leader of the men has given up and has walked away. So that realism, perhaps, of this form of the poem is solidified here. With this eclipse of interest, the incident was suddenly closed. So that's it. They've given up, and the narrator is kind of bringing their journal entry to a close as well, to an end. First in ones and twos, then all together, the men followed. So it just continues with that idea. This is a journal entry observing these men, and this is what happened. This is how the event ended. That left the pile still in midair, and me, of course. So interesting final sentiment in this poem. The pile of wood is still hanging midair. They didn't solve their problem. These strong, physical, masculine men didn't solve the problem. So again, is there a question being posed in this poem about the limits, perhaps, of that conventional, stereotypical masculinity and physical strength? It's still there midair. But of course, the narrator is also still there, and the problem hasn't been solved. So is there a strange irony there in that for all your intellect, you also haven't been able to do anything to assist? You are just an observer and an outsider. Or alternatively, actually, the fact that the narrator is still here and these other physical men aren't, does it go back to that egotistical idea that the narrator is better than these other men, that they remain? And because they think this sort of philosophical idea, I think, therefore I am. So the narrator still exists. They're the thinker, the intellect. But these builders or these labourers, these working men, is there a philosophical question that when they stop working, do they still exist? Or do they only exist as workers to fulfill that purpose and that job? And ultimately here in this poem, they haven't quite managed to do that either. So some different ways to view this poem. And so for me, it's a really, really interesting poem because you can look at it in that superficial level of this just being a diary entry. But I'd like you to go away as well and think about perhaps the more deeper metaphorical questions that this poem is asking us. Obviously, the more detailed notes are on the PowerPoint that I'll put on the portal. But it'd be really good to hear what you think in terms of maybe more deep metaphorical meanings for this poem. And just finally, I was asked by one student to try and include some more form and structure in these videos. Partly the reason why I haven't done that up until now is because the other stuff that I'm putting on the portal for you, other people's interpretations of the poems, they've often focused on the form and the structure of the poem, and I didn't want to kind of repeat any of that information. Hopefully, you may or may not have noticed that as I was going through the poem, I was trying to mention form a little bit more. And obviously, whenever I'm talking about caesura or enjambment or end stops, I'm talking about the structure of the poem. When I'm talking about shifting or narrowing, that is the structure of the poem. But I will leave you with a few final things as well. So just to consolidate, this poem takes the form of a journal entry. It's conversational in tone, as I said at the start, as if the narrator or speaker is speaking to us or speaking even to their diary. It's observational. I mentioned that throughout the poem. It's got that kind of tone of a recount narrative, because that's what a journal is, recounting the day, what you saw. As I've said, it can be read simply as a journal entry, or you can kind of look for this poem being a metaphor about masculinity or the role of man, or even, I don't know, existentialism if you wish. Look that up if you don't know what it is and see if you can apply it to the poem. It's written in first person and it's past tense, like a diary entry. In terms of the structure, obvious things, there are 11 stanzas. They are all 4 lines long, so all quatrains. So that's a very regimented style. It's a very uniform style. You might think about, why would the poet want that for this sort of poem? How does it link to what you know about the narrator? So when I went through it, I talked about the end stop and where that's used effectively to draw our attention to kind of moments of finality or ends of thoughts before the narrator goes on to its next thought or its next observation. And there's another question for you to think about there as well. So even though this is a strictly, every stanza is 4 lines long, some of the stanzas are in genre. So the one line runs on to the next stanza, because this is a stream of consciousness and the narrator's thoughts don't always feel fit neatly into certain lines. So there's a tension there, perhaps. Again, left it for you to kind of ponder, why is that tension? Why did the poet want to stick so strictly to those 4 lines if it doesn't naturally fit a diary entry, stream of consciousness? So I'll leave you to that hard work. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you all again soon. Take care.